Hey guys, this is Jennifer from Ask Scholars, and today we're going to be going over the general breakdown of the ACT science section. So, the science section on the ACT is one of the things that makes the ACT so unique and so different from its opposing standardized tests, the SAT. And at first, it does sound like a little daunting. It sounds like, you really do need to know a lot of science, but actually, once you start practicing and once you really get the hang of it, you don't really need to know much about science. It's more about testing whether or not you can analyze a lot of graphs and figures and these little short excerpts on experiments. So, as you can see here, at the top of every ACT science section, it gives you this exact same excerpt. And it's good to read this ahead of time so you don't waste time reading the directions when you're actually taking the test, because right here it says you only have 35 minutes for 40 questions, and if you break that down, it's about 52 and a half seconds per question. So you definitely want to be very conscious of your time so you don't waste any valuable seconds. So there are three main types of passages in the ACT science section, and the ACT science section has about 6 to 7 passages, and they vary in these three types of categories. So number one, we have data, charts, and graphs, and this typically takes up about 2 passages, and the main focus of this type of passage is really data representation. They don't give you too much textual information, and they really want to see if you can take these figures and really comprehend what they're asking for. So number two, we have experiments. This is commonly the most abundant type of passage in the entire ACT science section. They typically give you, like a lot of variables, and they want to make sure you understand like the role of each variable and the scientific method to ensure that you're very successful on this type of passage. Alright, so right here I have the 2019 to 2020 official release practice test from the ACT website. So I'm going to drop the link down below so that you guys have access to this practice test and you can, take it whenever you have the time to. Each passage has about, 6 to 7 questions for a total of 40 questions on the whole science test. Right here for this very first passage, we have data representation right off the bat. And some key things to notice, how this is data representation is that, there are obviously a lot of figures. We have a bar graph right here, and right after that we have a respective data table that talks about, the information in this bar graph. And it's very obvious that this is very like data representation. And even if you look at the questions, it asks you stuff like, according to figure number 1, they want you to refer back to this figure, and that's really one example of data representation. Alright, for the second passage of this science test, we have the opposing viewpoints passage. So this is one of the easier passages to identify because all you really have to look for is multiple people expressing their opinions on a certain topic. So right here, we have 4 different students talking about, what they think on the 5 properties for each of samples A through H. So if you look at the description, you can get like a general idea of what these students are going to be talking about. And as you can see here, we have student 1, student 2, student 3, and student 4 all talking about, what they think is their interpretation on the data given in this table. So the questions typically ask you about, what one particular person is talking about, what their interpretation is. And as you can see here, for example, in question 7, they're asking about, student 1's explanation. So in this case, we would look at, student 1's description again and then answer that question. So for the third passage, we have the experiments passage. So like I said earlier, this is the most abundant type of passage that you're going to see on the science section. And one of the ways you can identify whether or not you're on the experiments passage is by looking for these labels that quite literally say experiment 1 and experiment 2. And the word experiment is interchangeable with study, so be careful for that. But basically, the experiment section, they give you multiple experiments on one particular topic. And for this passage in particular, we can read the description right here, and it gives you like a sentence that talks about what the entire passage is about. So here it says 2 experiments were conducted to study the production of hydrogen in this reaction, and that reaction is referring to this one right here. It's very common to have a lot of graphs and data tables, and they want to ensure that you understand, what's going on in these graphs by giving you these questions that really test you on your knowledge of the variables that are being used. Yeah, so if we look really briefly at the questions, a lot of them tend to test you on the variables. So for example, if we look at question 15, it asks you, how many temperatures were tested in experiment 1 and how many temperatures were tested in experiment 2. So for this case, and a lot of questions that they ask you for the experiments passage, they want you to refer back to the passages, data and figures. So here we have the 2 graphs, and so for this question in particular, if we look at experiment 1, if we read the short description that they give you, it says, in each trial, a selected mass of iron, nickel, and zinc was tested at 30 degrees Celsius, and we can look at the axes right here. It doesn't really have another axis for temperature, so we know it's only at one temperature in particular. And yeah, we can cross out C and D because they don't have one for experiment 1. And if we go back to experiment 2, so read the description again, sorry. In each trial, 0.30 grams of iron, nickel, and zinc was tested at a selected temperature. So you can tell by the wording, it doesn't say, what temperature particularly they're doing this at, like it did in experiment 1. So it's really useful to look at the axes again. And here, it's very careful not to just literally count 1, 2, 3, 4 for the temperatures. You have to look at the data points right here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 temperatures that these elements are being tested at. So we have 5 in total. And if we look back at question 15, experiment 2 has 5, and your answer would be B. Alright, so for the fourth passage of this science section, we have data representation again. So as you can see here, we have a diagram, which is labeled as figure 1. Figure 2 is a graph, and figure 3 is also another graph. And if we look at the questions again, it's referring to very specific figures. So question 21, talking about figure 2. If we look at question 22, based on figure 3. So you kind of get the general gist. It asks a lot about different figures and, the commonalities and differences that these figures have. Alright, so for our fifth passage, we have another experiments passage. So here, this is one of the more unique ones. It won't always say experiments 1, 2, and 3, but you can see that they have these very obvious labels, and that tends to be a pattern. So here it says study, and once you see the word study, you know this is one of the experiments passages. And again, they give you a lot of figures. So here they give you a data table and another data table here. And this question, or this passage in particular, is talking about, the strains of bacteria and the amino acid histidine that they synthesize. And, the questions, they have the word study in them a lot. Usually it's interchangeable with experiment. So definitely be on the lookout for that to identify whether or not you're on the experiments passage. Alright, so for our very last passage of this particular science test, we have another experiments passage. So you can definitely see a trend here. It is the most abundant type of passage in the science section. So if you are practicing the science section, I highly recommend that you practice a lot on the experiments passages. So here we can look for the common identifiers again, and for this passage in particular, they use the words study 1 and study 2. So this is similar to the one that we had a few passages ago where it said, experiment 1 and experiment 2. Instead here, the words study and experiment are interchangeable, but if you see like multiple, studies and experiment labels, you know that you're on the experiments passage. So again, we have a lot of data representation. So here we have, a diagram, and we also have a beautiful, beautiful graph right here, and another one right here. So we look at the questions again. They talk about, what each study is talking about. So here for question 35, it's talking about study 2. 36 is talking about study 1. 37 is talking about study 2. So as you can see, it is a general gist where the questions ask you to really analyze the differences between the multiple experiments or studies. But yeah, hopefully this video helped a lot in terms of understanding the structure in the science section of the ACT. If you guys have any comments, questions, or concerns, you can always drop a comment down in the comment section below, or you can contact us on our Contact Us page on our website, which will also be linked down below. Thank you.